Hi guys, so I'm just going to go through the specific defense system with you this week. So last week we looked at the general defense system. That's kind of all of the stuff that stops you from getting sick in the first place. The specific defense system really is what we're looking at is if you do get sick or if you have specific diseases affect you. So your general defense system stops them getting in the first place and stops them from increasing in numbers. But if they do increase in numbers, if they get past that, then and only then does your specific defense system kick in. So your specific defense system is really made up of your white blood cells. You have numerous different types of white blood cells. So when you heard the term leukocyte, that's just a general term for white blood cells, all white blood cells. There are numerous different types. The two main ones you'll come across are lymphocytes and monocytes. And I mentioned to you last week, very obvious under the microscope, and I've seen them put it up to identify them by looking at them. So very obvious and easy identified by looking at them. Your lymphocytes have very little cytoplasm around them, if you see in this one, and their nucleus takes up most of the space, and the reason for that is because the nucleus is very, very busy because it has to produce antibodies, and antibodies are a chemical produced by your body, and they're the chemical that essentially helps to kill bacteria and viruses. They're very different and have nothing to do with antibiotics, but a lot of people mix the two terms up, so we'll discuss that later on, but just don't mix them up. The antibodies are what lymphocytes produce. The other type are your monocytes. Monocytes are an immature type of white blood cell, and they're produced in the white, in the bone marrow, but they go then to your spleen and your lymph nodes to mature. They're very obvious to look at because they have a very obvious kidney-shaped nucleus, much smaller than the lymphocyte, as you can see, but it's very distinctly a kidney shape. Okay, so make sure you're familiar with the shapes of those. So the monocytes, as I said, they're not mature, they're not ready to fight disease. They have to mature in your lymphatic system and in your spleen. So when they mature, they become a different type of cell called a macrophage, okay? So when you look at a macrophage under the microscope, they look different again. You can see the nucleus, it almost looks like there's multiple nucleuses, but if you can see, they're just noduled off each other. They're actually still connected. They're not separate nucleuses, but that's they look distinct. They're very similar to phagocytes. If you remember, phagocytes are the ones that extend the little arms out by phagocytosis. They extend out around the pathogen and they actually eat them. The difference with the phagocytes and the macrophage, phagocytes will recognize any foreign substance, anything foreign to the body and ingest it. With the macrophage, they specifically recognize a specific antigen. Now, an antigen is essentially a chemical on the surface of any living thing. We all have antigens. So my antigens on my cells will be different to the antigens on the outside of your cells. The antigens on the outside of the bacteria the virus pneumonia is different from, say, the bacteria streptococcus, which causes throat infection. So every single bacteria, every single virus has a different antigen on the surface. It's essentially what your body recognizes as foreign. Okay, so with your macrophage, the difference with them compared to phagocytes is that they present, when they've digested, say, the pathogen, whether it's a virus or a bacteria, they don't just break it down, they actually then take the antigens from that and present them on the outside. So these work alongside the lymphocytes, so they actually switch on or activate the lymphocytes to start making antibodies. So by presenting the antigen to a lymphocyte, the lymphocyte can recognize it. It will know exactly which antibody to produce. It will produce that in large numbers, and that will then cause the bacteria or the virus to be wiped out by the body. So it's more specific. Phagocytes are general, whereas the macrophage actually present the antigens. They're antigen presenting cells, or APCs, you might see on some of my notes, antigen presenting cells, and they, as I say, they work with your lymphocytes to cause the production of antibodies, specific antibodies. Every specific bacteria or virus that infects you in your body will produce a different type of antibody, or will cause the production of a different type of antibody for them to be killed. Okay, so the main way your lymphocytes work then, in conjunction with your macrophage, they attack antigen presenting cells. So anything that presents an antigen, whether it's the macrophage or whether it's, say, for instance, some cancer cells. That's how a lot of cancers don't develop, is because your body recognises and kills them. Others then produce antibodies themselves. So some attack them and some actually produce antibodies. All right. So yeah, that's the two main reasons. Now, we need from there to look really at what an antibody is. Okay, so an antibody is a protein produced by a white blood cell in response to an antigen. So the antibody is essentially a chemical or a protein produced in your body in response to an antigen. So what an antibody does, it specifically recognizes an antigen, which is the molecule on the outside of every bacteria, every virus, every cancer cell, and it's specific to that particular virus, that particular bacteria. So it stimulates the production of these particular chemicals by your white blood cells, specifically your lymphocytes. And essentially what they do is they stick to the antigen, the surface of the bacteria or the virus, and they work in a couple of different ways, which we will go through in terms of how that, but mostly they cause them to clump together, and then your macrophage or your phagocytes can go around and scavenge them and pick them up, so it stops them from replicating and reproducing in large numbers. All right. In terms of what antigens are, there's a number of different things. So they're anything foreign to our body. Okay. So the most common ones we would see is the molecules on the surface of a virus. They're like their fingerprint, essentially. Bacteria, fungi, any other microbes, any other microorganisms you're talking about that present to the body, they will all have specific cell walls. If you remember, your bacteria, your fungi, their cell walls have different makeups, so therefore they're recognized as foreign to our body when they infect us, so they're seen as antigens and other things. So if you remember when we did the heart and the blood, we would have talked about blood compatibility, blood type. So if you're type A and you were given type B blood, your body would recognize it as foreign, because of the antigens on the surface. They have different proteins on the surface, so your body would recognize that as foreign. It's very dangerous. That's why when you get an organ transplant, you need to have the same tissue type, because otherwise your body will see it as foreign. It will reject the organ, and by reject I mean essentially your white blood cells will damage the organ because it sees it as foreign. Other things would be the likes of people with hay fever. They incorrectly recognize pollen as an antigen, as something dangerous, and that causes your immune response to kick in. So all those are examples just of antigens. You need to be able to give a couple of examples there, guys. Okay. So in terms of how the whole response works, every single possible antigen that is presented to your body responds to differently. So chickenpox, for example, has a specific antigen. The virus that causes that. Measles has a different one. Mumps has a different one. So the reason we get vaccinated for them is so our body knows what to expect, knows what to look for, and therefore can recognize it and get the immune response up quickly. And we're going to look at how that affects it. So an antibody will specifically only attach to one type of antigen. A pathogen could have numerous antigens on the surface, but a specific antibody will only attach to one and recognize it. Okay. Each antigen stimulates the production of only one specific antibody. Antibodies function to destroy the pathogens in a number of ways. So by grouping them together, or clump them together, they prevent them from getting inside your body cells, and then your phagocytes can eat them. Okay, by clumping them in large enough clumps, it can actually make them inactive. Essentially, it stops them from reproducing or replicating, and therefore that inactivates them so they don't increase in number. And it also triggers the complement system. That's the third one. So again, you need to know all three. The main one that most people would be familiar with is the top one, the phagocytes there, but the complement system would also be stimulated, and the best way I can describe that is it would be like putting a pin in a water balloon. It would cause it to burst. So they're a type of protein that will accumulate on the bacteria's cell wall and essentially cause it to burst. Okay. So if you can imagine then the antibodies attaching, specifically say that's chickenpox, it's gotten in, it recognises the little antigen because you've had your vaccine, it clumps them all together so they can't replicate or get inside a cell, and then when they're floating around the blood, a phagocyte will pick them up, or a macrophage, either or, and clump them together and destroy them. Okay, so that's essentially how it stops you getting sick. Okay, the reason this is really beneficial to us is because your body, once it's done that once, it creates a small number, just a very small number of what we call memory cells, and those memory cells stay in our blood long term. So say for instance you've had chickenpox, the reason you can only get it once, the first time you get it, it takes your body about up to 2 weeks, anything up to between a week and 2 weeks to work out which antibody to produce to kill it. If you've had it already, it knows straight away which antibody to produce, so it gets those numbers up quickly, and it gets it killed essentially before it gets time to get hold on your body. The reason you get it the first time is because your body doesn't know which antibody to produce against it, so it takes a little bit longer and they get time to establish. So that's the whole basis of how vaccination works, and we'll talk about that later on as well. All right. So there's a graph here. This slide I'll come back to. The graph here explains that whole idea of exposure to antigen. So this graph, I wouldn't say necessarily need to draw it, but you definitely need to be familiar with it, interpret it, and be able to say what's happening. So if you're first exposed to an antigen, okay, it takes you anything roughly about 2 weeks. We'll say in around 2 weeks to be able to produce the correct antibody, to work out which antibody to produce and then get the numbers up. But you can see the numbers don't get particularly high, so at that stage you're quite sick and it takes you probably a week then to fight it off. If, however, you're exposed to that same antigen again, so whether it's chickenpox or whether it's mumps, measles, that you've been vaccinated against, what happens is, instead of taking a good week to work out which one to produce, it works it out in the space of around 5 days, and it gets those numbers up in much greater, so it produces the antibody in a much higher number. Instead of producing a number of antibodies that it doesn't know which one works, it knows which one works, it produces it in a really high number, and it kills that bacteria or virus before it gets a chance to get hold. So that's why you don't generally get sick from the same disease twice, because you hold those memory cells that remember it and can produce those antibodies. Okay, so this slide here explains that graph. As I say, you don't need to know how to draw it, but if it comes up, you need to be able to interpret it and say what's happening. So on primary contact with a pathogen, i.e. a bacteria or virus, it takes your body 14 days on average to produce a high enough level of the antibody to kill it. So therefore, you're sick for about a week or 2, okay? On a second exposure, your memory cells know which one needs to be produced, so it can multiply quickly at high levels, and it only takes about 5 days. So if it only takes about 5 days, you're not going to get as sick, they're not going to get as high in number, and it stops you from getting sick, okay? So the common cold, the reason you get that loads of times, because there's numerous different types of viruses that cause it. You're not going to get exactly the same flu twice. There's numerous flus that cause numerous viruses that cause the flu there as well. Okay, so this here just sums up the general and specific defense system and where we're going with that. So that's as far as I'm going to go with you today.